I'm Rebecca Rear, Director of the Climate for Health program at ecoAmerica. And while we're all tuning in virtually, I'm hosting from Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Anacostan people. Today's Let's Talk Climate episode is co-hosted by the American Public Health Association Center on Climate, Health, and Equity. In their climate change and health needs assessment completed a couple years ago, APHA identified the need to prioritize climate change among public health professionals and in trainings and resources for the public health workforce. By launching the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity in November 2018, APHA leadership has signaled serious investment in climate and health issues. We'll get into today's topic, Climate of Health and Hope, New Opportunities for Public Health Professionals, with our fantastic guests. Angela Chalk, Executive Director of Health Community Services and past President of the Louisiana Public Health Association. Hi, Angela. And Mariah Norwood, Infectious Disease American Indian Liaison at the Minnesota Department of Health. Hi, Mariah.
See you.
And Jaylan Jacobs, Co-President of the Emory Climate Analysis and Solutions Team. Welcome, Jaylan.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you for being here today. Really, to start out our discussion, I wanted to hear from each of you a little bit about how you personally started making that connection between climate change and health impacts. Jaylan, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I actually knew that I wanted to work in climate the first time I heard about climate change back in my 9th grade science class. But it wasn't until that I got to Emory and started working with the Emory Climate Analysis and Solutions team that I learned more about the climate impacts and possible solutions. And through that, I was introduced through the Atlanta Regional Climate and Health Project. And I quickly realized that on campus, not that many people cared about climate change or the environment, but a lot of people do care about their health and the health of their loved ones. So I really feel that the way to appeal to a larger audience about climate impacts is through the health lens.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And it actually reflects some of the recent research that ecoAmerica just put out on people trusting health professionals for information, and that it's health that resonates on the topic. So thanks, that's great to hear. And Mariah, why don't you go next?
Sure. I grew up in Oklahoma on what is now a Superfund site. So I grew up thinking it was normal for water to taste weird after it rained because of the lead in our systems, and for people to, not encourage formula use, not because of the health impacts of breastfeeding, but because of what could be in the water that you're mixing for your baby. And I didn't know that that wasn't a normal thing that everyone experienced until I moved to college and was like, this is not safe. And when I was in middle school, the EPA bought out the town, shut everything down, turned it into a Superfund site. And it was land that was then given back to a tribal nation to clean up the messes of corporations from lead and zinc mining. And so I think my whole existence as a human has really been living through the impacts of health inequities because of situations that are not only climate issues, but also just greater health implications with the changes of environmental, things that aren't environmentally just. And so I think my desire for environmental justice really made me see how climate justice was this huge lens to push through, and how you can't really talk about climate justice without also talking about health.
And Angela.
Thank you, Rebecca, for first of all having me. I had a little technical glitch, but thank you. For me, realizing just how important our climate is and the impacts of that would have to go back to Hurricane Katrina, when we saw a Category 5 hurricane hit us, and it demonstrated to us just how unprepared we were for such a catastrophic storm. And from there, things just seemed to, it started like a roller coaster effect, where you learn one thing and then another. And so as a result of having the increased storm surge in such a catastrophic storm, I realized that through the Foundation for Louisiana, with their Lead the Coast initiative, that we were losing our coastal land at a football field an hour, and that there were things that we could do to mitigate that, such as shore stabilization or even planting trees back into the wetlands. And one thing just led to another, how we are able to adapt strategically and what that impact has for those of us who live in urban settings. And so in my community, we're also facing what we now know as the urban heat island effect, because while we all knew it was getting hot or hotter, we didn't realize that that was also impacting our health outcomes, such as asthma, diabetes, our ability to do daily essential activities by being outside or traveling to the grocery. Even if you're in an air conditioned space, we realize how much harder those utilities were working in order to cool us down. And so through one thing leading to another, you learn that everything is connected, and it impacts our health outcomes. And it's just phenomenal for me to be able to bring that news to folks in my community. And as you can see in the background, when we were talking earlier, this is a native tree, a sweet bay magnolia, that also uptakes water. So when we're having urban flooding issues, this tree can absorb water and it cools down. And just the fact with nature-based solutions and seeing those events occur. Like one day I came out and this tree was providing shade. I didn't realize, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh wow, it's providing shade. It provides food for our birds and other habitat that we don't generally recognize on a daily basis. And so that's how I came to this work.
Yeah, and all of your stories really resonate with me as well, because I was in high school when I first, came to these issues, and there was lead in the pipes in my high school, and I realized, it was later when I found out about the neurotoxic properties of lead, why we actually couldn't drink the water. At the time, I don't ever recall them telling us why not to drink the water, just telling us not to drink it, which of course is the best way to get a 15-year-old not to do something, tell them not to do it. And I just remember very early on realizing, okay, so we must make sure that information gets to the affected population.
And when you talk about lead in our pipes, I mean, as a child, and I know I'm a little bit older than the panelists here, if we were playing outside in the summertime, we couldn't run in and out of our parents' homes, so we drank water from the we call it a hose pipe, but the garden hose. And so, can you imagine if you saw a child drinking water from the garden hose these days? There are holes, or even purchasing water that was unheard of when I was a child, to be able to purchase a bottle of water for drinking. And then learning about alkaline, just regular filtered water. So our communities and our world has changed so drastically that we just have to pay attention and pay close attention to what's going on around us.
Yeah, I think and I think that sort of leads to my next question. And we've started to talk about this, but you're all joining from different parts of the country. And we do know that climate change looks different in different places and affects health differently in different places. So how interested to hear from you how climate change, what does climate change look like when you look out your window? And how is that impacting your health, your family's health, your community's health, sort of nearby? Mariah, why don't you start?
Sure. I am joining today from Chanchayapi, otherwise known as Lower Sioux, which is Dakota Territory in southwest Minnesota. And Minnesota's climate has drastically been changing. The state's warmed 1 to 3 degrees in the last century. Floods are more frequent, and that is not just throughout spring or times where that normally happened, but also because of ice coverings on lakes that is freezing later and melting sooner. And the climate is changing because the earth is warming, and that is because of what people are doing. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here with this panel, but I think within the state of Minnesota, that looks like changes in ecosystems, changes in agriculture, changes in air pollution, in human health, changes in lakes and rivers, which are highly valued in our state for not only the beauty, but for recreation, heavy precipitation and flooding. And I think as someone who is an Indigenous person, these changes really are seen as huge impacts that will have negative health impacts for Indigenous people, as well as other Minnesotans and people throughout the state. But it's more complicated than just weather changing or rains changing. And I think one of the biggest things here is that climate adaptation strategies aren't a thing that are new for Indigenous people. Lots of communities moved to different spaces when the seasons changed, and they would come, specifically in Minnesota, people would come and set up camps in woods to tap sugar maple trees in the spring and would hunt and fish in the summer. And that would be within large mile radiuses of their villages. And then they would fall in the fall, people would camp next to wild rice beds for rice harvests. And those seasons, as weather changes, all of those growing seasons change too. And with heavy rainfall, wild rice, which is something that is uniquely Minnesotan, and very traditionally important to tribes that exist here. That has negative implications for health, but it also has negative implications for how culture can be practiced. And these are things that I think aren't always discussed when you talk about climate change, and how they're not just impacting our daily lives, but how they're impacting traditions for people who have existed for centuries in the same location.
Yeah, thank you for bringing out that component as well. That's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. It's giving me a lot to think about right now. So while I think, Angela, why don't you go next?
Okay, so for us, we live in a 300-year-old city, and I'm coming from you all from the 7th Ward neighborhood of New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm 4th generation resident from this community. And so even last night, as we were expecting the torrential rains to come that were moving through, our mayor had to issue an alert that, hey, it's raining, we're susceptible to flooding. And so the parking restrictions were lifted. So people know that they can park their cars on what we call the neutral grounds in the event that we have a flooding event. And so we've seen more intense, more frequent rainfall in our city, and we haven't aged what we call a great infrastructure. And so when it rains in our communities, the first thing we're concerned about is getting our car to higher ground and what's going to be the impact. So we don't know what that impact is going to do. And so the work that I'm doing in collaboration with Waterwise Gulf South and 4 other organizations, May Consortium, Bunny Friendly Association, Holly Grove Dixon, and Idlewood Park neighborhood, we're collaborating to educate, and I forgot groundwork. We're collaborating with those organizations in the communities that they serve to teach people about green infrastructure. What is green infrastructure? How does that impact you? What changes that you can do to complement our pumps, pipes, and canals that we use to push water into Lake Pontchartrain to stop us from flooding. And so that has been a phenomenal response because all of the projects that we put in are community driven. So this is a true collaboration of working with communities as opposed to when people say working in communities. I like to say we work with communities because I can't come to your neighborhood to tell you where it's flooding or what's important. I can only work with you with identifying those solutions. And so that's why we build that momentum with engaging, empowering, and educating people. And I'd just like to thank our funders for believing in these community-based organizations, Kresge, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, for believing in us to be able to have that change that others are just marginalized. And we are the ones who are affected most adversely and have the least resources to rebound from events.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, especially because we know the impact that direct funding to communities and direct funding to environmental justice and climate justice, communities really makes a difference when there's direct funding available. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because that is something that comes up frequently in these kinds of conversations. So I think it's important to think about that and the funding space and how we can encourage philanthropy to work with communities. So thanks for lifting that up.
Yes.
Jaylan, why don't you tell us what climate change looks like in Atlanta?
Yes, so I'm actually calling in from Chamblee, Georgia, which is the ancestral land of the Muskogee and Cherokee people, but it's just outside of Atlanta. So many of the impacts Angela was speaking about resonate with what's going on here in the Southeast and in Georgia. Extreme heat, which in the city is intensified, of course, by the urban heat island effect, can cause things like heat stress conditions, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, which is the body being unable to regulate its temperature. It can also exacerbate existing, cardiovascular and respiratory issues. And regional flash flooding due to heavy downpour is a huge issue in the city. We have large amounts of impervious surfaces in Atlanta, which is, roadways, things like that, and there's nowhere for the water to go. I actually had a peer's car that just got washed down the road. So crazy things have been happening. But the Georgia Climate Project has done a really great job of being able to document how climate change is impacting Georgia communities across the state through this series called the Georgia Climate Stories. And they've also highlighted, drought and hurricane impacts on crop yields and, coastal flooding and sea level rise, which is a huge issue for the Georgia Barrier Islands.
And I appreciate that lifting up storytelling, right? Because I think we can all geek out about some data, and we can, I think we were talking a little bit about the studies that we read for fun and thinking about, so we can nerd out on the data for sure, and happy to do that anytime. But it's so important to pair the data, the quantitative data with storytelling, and I think that that's such an important tool in our toolbox for thinking about those things. And I think, APHA, Center for Climate Health and Equity, I think they have their Eco Bookworms Club, reading stories to kids. And I think, weaving in the storytelling with the coupled with the data, which is always very important, that really makes the powerful case, right? So appreciate, that visual of a car floating down the road is very powerful, as is realizing the cultural importance of food. I think no matter what background you have, food is center. All of the pictures I saw yesterday of the corned beef and cabbage, for St. Patrick's Day was it's like no matter the background, food is so important to our culture, and climate change is impacting that. And so it's not just about nutrition, but also about cultural practices. So I'm personally just sitting with that a little bit and realizing that. So again, thanks for lifting up these stories.
And if you mentioned food, let me just jump in here right quick. It's crawfish season here in New Orleans. And so if we have those natural beds that are disturbed as a result of climate, then the rippling of that is what that seafood industry. And although I don't like to peel crawfish, I certainly enjoy it. I love crawfish biscuits, crawfish etouffee. I can't imagine what that impact would be to that industry and those folks who work in that industry. And so that's not just an economic impact, that is also a social and cultural norm that we have here in Louisiana.
It's true for crabs in Maryland too, right? That's where, in Baltimore, it's been huge impact on crabs and the seafood industry for sure. We want to talk about the public opportunities for the public health workforce and to build the public health workforce, to meet the demands of a changing climate. And I want to bring in the audience here. And we had a question from Sarah from Arlington, Virginia, who says, how can we help our employees identify ways in which their day-to-day work might be different when considering climate change? And another way of asking that might be, what do you think should be some key components of a climate-ready public health workforce? So what does that climate-ready public health workforce look like? So Angela, why don't you kick us off with this one?
And as I think about that, I think that employers need to be more eco-friendly in the materials that they use. That's one way to do it. I mean, we're not going to get our way out of this with just changing plastic straws. You have to look at a program holistically. What is your energy source? Alternative energy sources. What impact does the materials that you use have on your production? And realizing that there's an incremental behavior social change that can occur in your organization, and younger generations are demanding that. And it's incumbent upon employers to realize that it's not only socially beneficial, but it adds to their bottom line in attracting the best employees that they can. And if you look at it, the cost for production of whatever it is that they're producing goes down because you don't have so much waste. And so I would say to employers, change your culture at your organizations. And it begins with one person, and just not the recycling of paper. Look at your organization holistically and start to make those changes.
It's great. Jaylan, want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind for me is really having robust emergency preparedness and response plans, incorporating an equity lens for vulnerable populations. And, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and we really need to have community-tailored and culturally competent plans for communities across the nation. As COVID-19 has shown us clearer than ever before, emergency situations will always exacerbate existing inequities. So we really need to carry that into every aspect of public health moving forward, I think. But also, basic training on climate science need to knows, the difference between weather and climate, anthropogenic fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas effect, or, albedo effect, just simple things like that, I think are really important just for from an understanding of the root causes of climate change is really important. And then lastly, the advisory board, the APHA Center for Climate and Health Advisory Board and our sub-working groups are really discussing ways to offer technical assistance, mentorship, guidance, and expanded funding to build up the capacity of the public health workforce on the topics of climate and health and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, yeah.
That's great. And Mariah?
I think building off of the inequity piece or the disparity piece, I think a huge thing for me when I'm thinking about being climate ready, there are the really great things that both Angela and Jaylan mentioned, and things that you can do holistically within your work environment and really preparing for worst case scenario things that we know could happen with disasters. But I think for me, the big thing that stands out is behavioral health preparedness. And I think that specifically when we're talking about, I work for the state of Minnesota, and I'm in our cultural faith and disabilities branch. And so the majority of my coworkers are public health workers, and we work in community, largely in communities of color that we also are members of. So I serve as one of our American Indian liaisons, which is usually really great for my soul, but there are days where it's difficult, right? There are, I think as public health workers, there are days where you get to see the really great pieces of community, but you get to see all the pain too. And I think when it comes to talking about climate change and climate justice and environmental justice and all of the things that are impacted with that, you can't have a public health climate ready workforce if you aren't also talking about how you need to address mental health needs within your workforce and within your communities. I think that is, like Jaylan said, further exacerbated in communities that are already like hurting from all of the things that are going on in our country right now. I think as Indigenous people, we face the highest, the worst, however you want to look at it, health and socioeconomic disparities. A lot of the time, we have the lowest life expectancy as of any race in the United States, of any ethnic group within the US. And in some communities with climate change, those disparities are only growing. And I think the vulnerabilities that exist are only going to be exacerbated. And if you're not preparing your workforce for behavioral health needs for themselves as employees that they can address to really encounter and combat some of the injustice that they will be seeing, I think they also need to be able to be prepared to provide tools for mental health needs as a result of climate injustice to the communities that they're working in.
And can I piggyback on that as well? I think employers and organizations also need to recognize the privileges that we have, and we all have privileges of some sort. But when we're talking about privilege in the sense of one race being more superior than the other, I think in order for us to move forward as a nation, we have to recognize that, we have to call it out, and we have to heal together, because this planet, we only have one Earth. And so if we don't take care of the Earth that we have, we're all going to be doomed, regardless of our race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. So this is, if there isn't any other topic that we can come together on, we need to come together on the issue of climate, because it affects all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I couldn't have said that better myself. So, Mariah, and I really appreciate you bringing up mental health as well. I think if Jess hasn't already, she'll put in the chat our mental health report on climate change that we did with the American Psychological Association, and it's a topic that I think, if anything, COVID has normalized a lot of conversations about mental health, and a lot of people are seeking mental health care that maybe weren't before or didn't realize they needed it. They needed professional health or outlets in previously, but like you said, I think climate change is increasing people's anxiety in different ways, and people, and there are others who feel angry, particularly younger generations who are angry about the action that was not taken prior, even though we knew about this. So I really appreciate bringing up mental health and the need for mental health care, and the workplace obligation to provide that care. I think that's really important. I want to ask another question that actually somebody asked on a webinar I was on yesterday, but he's also here today in the audience. So I'm pretending like he asked it today. So Jim asks, and this is really building on the last conversation that we were having, but often I hear the burden of preparation, mitigation, and response to health-related issues related to climate change disruption on individuals. So it's sort of build, that behavioral health framework a little bit, right? Like it's people, it's, what can you do, right? But rarely are these framed at the community level, such as the role in preparation response via the local, tribal, and state public health infrastructures. So can you talk a little bit more explicitly about the role of the public health system? So really just building on the conversation we were just having, but what is the role in the public health system of addressing health impacts from climate change? Jaylan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I really think that climate justice work and health equity work cannot exist without community, so I really feel like the role of the public health workforce is to engage with the community in the ways it is not traditionally done before, dismantling the ways it has really engaged with community work before, and getting to a point where public health professionals can share power, values, and mutual respect with community members that they're working together with. Because these community members are the resident experts of their own experience and should be treated as such. So we should really incorporate community members at every step of the process, and have a public health response that they are fully backing, from planning, data collection, implementation, evaluation, like every step we want them involved, because, like Mariah said before, these communities are hurting, and it is our responsibility as public health workforce to address those issues. So.
I'm gonna go to Angela next, and leave the last answer to that to someone who's in the public health, the state public health department. So Angela, go ahead.
And I would agree with Jaylan on all of those points, but that's going to require training of our public health professionals to realize what their role is in working with communities. You left out another one, Jaylan, respect. Being respectful of the community and being respectful of your peers. I mean, that look like me, because oftentimes my credentials are questioned. And I've had someone to ask me what my credentialing was. And my response to them was, well, I need to know what yours are to see if you can qualify mine. And so being respectful in working in communities and realizing that the work that you do has to be real and implemented, not something to be placed in a manual read by journals, placed on a shelf. That does none of us any good in our communities if you have the resources and tools to come up with a strategic plan for us. And to your credit, Mariah, um, behavioral health, we're all facing something, some sort of trauma. And if anybody says that they're not, they're only fooling themselves, and they really need to look at their what their crisis situation may be. And in the Black community, that's going to require a lot of messaging and trust building with public health professionals that come into our communities.
Mariah, go ahead.
Well, I think building off of what Angela just said, I think that is the key message, right? These messages need to be pushed for community by community. And I think that maybe our job as a public health workforce isn't to be the one going into communities of color and saying, we know exactly the solutions for you, because we don't. I don't know the solutions for Jaylan's community. I don't know the solutions for Angela's community. Most of the time, I probably don't even know the solutions for mine, because there are people way smarter than me. But I know what I can do. And I think that the only community that I would ever feel remotely okay speaking in like part of is for my own, and that's with their blessing. And I think that is, there's no one right way to do this, because we're not the same. And I think we don't have the same issues. There aren't the same climate issues in Minnesota that there are in Georgia or in Louisiana. There aren't the same climate issues within communities of color as in white communities always. And maybe the issues are the same, but the way they impact us aren't. And that's because of systemic oppression and because of systems that have predominantly been created to only benefit white men. And maybe I'm not allowed to say that, but my bad. But I think that there are a lot of issues in this country that we don't talk about because they're messy. And I think, like Angela said, climate justice is the thing that impacts all of us, whether we want to talk about it or not. And we can ignore it, but what is that going to do? It's going to lead to things that we can't come back from, and in a way that isn't going to benefit future generations, in a way that isn't going to benefit us. And I think that, like, as an Indigenous woman, growing up, there's this whole, within my community and other Native communities too, but I am not speaking for all 574 tribes. There's not one singular Native culture, and I do not want anyone to get that from this talk. I can only speak for my own and my experience. But growing up, I was taught that we are supposed to make decisions in existing on the world as we are, with the expectation and the ideologies in mind that the decisions we're making are going to impact 7 generations ahead of us. And that the decisions that we're choosing, we need to be thankful for 7 generations before us, for the decisions they made for this earth to be here, and for this relationship that we share with nature, with the planet, with everything here, with each other. We can't just be thankful for who is here now. We have to thank the people who came before us, and we have to be thinking of the people who are going to come after us. And that's not just in 2 years, it's not in 5, it's in 7 generations. And I think that for me is how we can't come up with solutions that are going to be one size fits all solutions, because those aren't going to work. And the way that we attack even talking about climate justice within Indigenous communities may look different than in Black communities, and it may look different in Latin communities, but I think ultimately we all want the same thing, right? We all want to exist. We all want to have feasts with our family and our friends. We all want to be able to enjoy the sunshine or to be out on the river in the summer. We want all of these things that take place in coordination with nature. And if we don't make changes that are going to benefit our communities, we're not going to have that relationship moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I could just bounce off of those both amazing points you guys made, I think it is really important to just challenge the status quo. Like, as public health professionals, we need to be challenging the existing power systems, institutions, and methodologies in our work that are upholding these systems of oppression and hindering progress towards climate justice. And part of that is facilitating conversations and trainings on racial equity, even if it's uncomfortable. So thank you so much for those points. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have to say that, and I've coined this term before, our collective connectedness. And I use the Mississippi watershed as that collective connectiveness, because 48% of our waters pass through that Mississippi watershed, which passes through my home of New Orleans. And so each day that I wake up, I realize just how connected I am to you in Minnesota and to folks in Georgia, from the west to the east. And so we have to be mindful of how we are connected to people. And thank you, Mariah, for letting me know that while I knew I stood on the shoulders of my ancestors, I didn't realize it was 7 generations back and then 7 generations forward. I have the responsibility to make sure that they inherit a sustainable planet and to be connected to one another. So I've really enjoyed this and learning so much. Thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same here. It makes me think about, like the actions I'm taking now. It's like, would my great grandkid approve of this? Like, what? Like, I gotta think through this for a second. So I do. I think it's good framing, right? It's like, I think that's really important framing, and I too am learning quite a bit. And I see that the chat is very vibrant. So really appreciate. You're clearly inspiring lots of others, lots of our listeners tuning in. So appreciate that too. I want to answer a quick question that came in from Shireen, who asks, can you discuss careers in epidemiology related to maternal health disparities and climate change? I know that's pretty specific. So I just wanted to point to, actually just this morning, we posted a blog on Climate for Health about the need for climate solutions that prioritize Black births. So there's a growing area of research on impacts of heat and air pollution on birth outcomes, on infant mortality, that Black babies are more likely to die in this country than white babies. And how are we, the studies need to be done to get at the root cause of that, hint systemic racism, but that what do solutions look like? Because we also know that Black women treated by Black doctors have a higher, more successful births. And so just thinking about that and thinking about all that. So if any of you have quick answers there, I also want to move on to another question. We've gotten a couple questions about the intersection of climate and COVID. So I do want to answer some of those, but Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, I say that as young professionals entering this field, be the visionary. You are the change. And outside of the King Memorial in Atlanta, never doubt there's the fountain there. Never doubt what a group of small, committed citizens can do to change the world. So you are the visionary. If there isn't anyone else doing it, then you do it.
Agreed. And it's, follow that, follow the, if it feels right, follow that path, right? I mean, I think that goes to what Jaylan was saying about challenging the status quo. You might be starting that march yourself, but folks, maybe it's because someone else was thinking it, but they couldn't quite get there, right? And so I totally agreed. And so I do want to get to some of the questions that have come in about the intersection of COVID and climate. And we had one from Lisa, and it looks like one from Gabriella. And they, so the questions are, in what ways do you think the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic emphasized climate health issues? So help solidify that climate and health overlap? And then sort of a similar question is, what can we learn from COVID-19 response to build that mobilization, right? To build that public health infrastructure, to mobilize on climate and health solutions. So, has COVID-19 brought more attention to the climate and health intersection? And then how can we learn from that to build the public health infrastructure on the climate response? I saw Angela unmute, so go to you first.
I think COVID has shown the light on a lot of disparities in a lot of different areas. And and so once something is out of the Pandora's box, we cannot put it back in. It has to be addressed because, again, COVID was non-discriminatory. It did not care who you were, where you lived, and it impacted us in different regions of our country. And we each have, as we've said before, we each have different climates in our region. And so, to borrow Dr. Fauci's words, these are not mine, these are Dr. Fauci's, we will look back at this in 10, 20 years on how we came together, how pharmaceutical companies came together in rapid time to develop a vaccine. And the history will show what our government did to provide safety for its residents of the country. And so I'm amazed at the scientists who in rapid time were able to develop a vaccine to be able to get us to the point. And as Dr. Fauci said, we're at the last mile of the bridge. And so wherever you feel about this, or whatever you feel about this, or wherever you're at on the spectrum, know that all of us are important, and we have to realize what our roles are as far as climate, health disparity, racism, all of that, to get us to across that last mile of the bridge.
Mariah, why don't you pick it up from there?
I think that, like Jaylan and Angela have both discussed throughout this presentation, I think truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of people. And I think the pandemic has shown us that equity is not a thing we can keep sweeping under a rug. It's not a discussion we can keep avoiding having. It's not a discussion that is only for certain people. It's a thing we all need to do. I think that recently, through the pandemic, we've seen equity and health equity particularly become buzzwords. And I think that for many people in this country, they're a thing we just do. And they're a thing that we exist seeing inequity because of where we were born or what color our skin is, or lots of other things that have negative health impacts. I think equity is this thing that I've always had to exist understanding. My mom is Cherokee, my dad is white, and I understand the privilege that I have in health outcomes, in not worrying about where my name is going to be in a job application line because it sounds white. Lots of things that I've never had to worry about because of the color of my skin, based on the color of the skin of other people in my family. I understand the privilege that comes with that. And I think we're seeing it through COVID and through vaccine planning in different states that that equity it's not always everyone's priority, and it's not, and I don't think that's a thing we can keep doing. I don't think it's a thing we can keep doing in terms of this pandemic, in terms of fighting this virus, in terms of prioritizing solutions for climate injustices. I don't think we can keep avoiding having these conversations. I think, like Angela pointed out, there is a pandemic is kind of it's kind of like racism. It doesn't really have boundaries that it doesn't cross. There's no jurisdiction. It stays inside. It just goes and it spreads and it's a mess, and it impacts everyone. And I think that while we're seeing through this pandemic what can happen when we really prioritize funding for targeted items, what can happen. And I mean, it's unheard of that things have happened in the timeline that they've happened in. And I think that this has shown us what can happen when we all work together and when we prioritize community. And I am hopeful through this pandemic that while it has highlighted gross inequities that exist in our country, that people of color have been screaming about for a long time. I think it's brought this to this big forefront of we can't keep avoiding discussions that are uncomfortable. And I think that this has shown us that we need to be intentional in relationship building as public health professionals. We need to be intentional in policy making as governments, whether that's local, state, federal, tribal, any sovereign jurisdiction. We need to be intentional in making these relationships and decisions that lead to health and economic benefits for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's the really key point. But making the link between that tough discussion and that data that shows that, for example, COVID or climate is affecting certain populations more. But then what does that mean for the solutions? You can't have that acknowledgement and then give every single county in the state the same number of doses. You can't have that recognition and then roll out the vaccine with the exact same messaging across the state and in every community. So how are we helping to build that bridge between some of the recognition that's happening about inequities and the solutions that are necessary to build equity in health outcomes? And that the bridge is what I'm not seeing yet. I'm seeing some of the discussions in the acknowledgement, but I am not seeing that the actual making the link between, that means to get the solutions we want, we need to change the policy, change the implementation, change the system. And the acknowledgement is at least a step in the right direction. Let's give his credit. Yep. Okay, great. But build the whole bridge. I don't want a bridge to nowhere. I want a bridge to the solution and better health outcomes. All right, I'll get off.
I think one thing that we are seeing through the pandemic, sorry for double speaking, is that with tribes in Minnesota and tribes across the country specifically, we're seeing, this is the first time in my lifetime that I remember seeing tribal sovereignty honored through healthcare, right? It's the first time I've ever remembered seeing it. And in a way that wasn't a back burner idea, in a way that wasn't what about the tribes? In a way that maybe actually is on a path toward equity. And and I think that looks different across states. I think it looks different across tribes. But I think that within Minnesota, all of the tribes were given the opportunity to choose. They don't have to follow the same plan for vaccination that the state does because they're sovereign nations. And I think that is a thing that we need to normalize, because who has the best health outcomes and ideas for their community? The people that live there. And I think that we're seeing when we go to community and we're giving tribes across the nation access to this vaccine that is for a virus that is disproportionately killing people. There's been research that's shown that 1 out of 475 Native Americans in the United States has died since the pandemic. 1 in 475. That's a disgusting number. In a population where we've already been created to stop existing. And I think that we're seeing when you give people the ability to make solutions for their own people, positive things happen. And I actually was on a call this morning with the state, and we were talking about Minnesota has a vaccine connector tool, and you can look up and see the percentage of people in the state who are whatever age range you want to look at, and see in comparison with racial differences across the state on who has been vaccinated. And I think it's showing where we're doing great at equity and where we're not. But something that we saw today is within the 65 and older population, 0.7% of the state of Minnesota, which is really small, identify that 65 and older identifies as Native American, and 0.7 of that population has been vaccinated, which is awesome. I mean, we're talking, the tribes have done so well at giving vaccines for their own communities based on their own plans and their own messages and their own strive to improve the health outcomes in their community, that we're seeing rates where people are vaccinated at percentages that are unheard of in this timeline.
Yep.
And I think that is how you make that bridge go to not nowhere. Is you let communities decide. You let communities make their own decisions because they have the best answers.
Yeah. And I think Angela wanted to chime in, and then I want to give Jaylan a chance to answer this question before we have to go into some lightning round because we're reaching the end of it.
And to thank you, Rebecca, and to piggyback on what Mariah said, we have to think about inclusivity and the messaging and who's receiving that message. And so I know that in Orleans Parish, to our mayor's credit, Mayor LaToya Cantrell, she has followed the science with the folks who are advising her. So in Orleans Parish, we have one of the lowest COVID positivity rates, and I think it's at 1.5%. But in order to get that message out to the Black community, who always refers back to the Tuskegee incident, that why people don't want to get vaccine, we actually had people on the ground in communities teaching folks how to properly wear masks, and to have health advocates and community health workers out there in our communities explaining why this should be done, why this is necessary. And local physicians, Black physicians, were shown taking the COVID vaccine themselves and having their families involved. And so when people start to see that, who really don't understand the Tuskegee experiment, they just have possibly heard about it and say, this is what they did Black people in 1932. Well, times have changed. As a result of that Tuskegee experiment, we have new policies and regulations to follow. But when you see your neighbors getting vaccinated and they explain why they're getting vaccinated to protect ourselves, that starts again to have that rippling effect. And so I can't remember what the last statistics are, but we are high in that rate of getting people first with the first vaccine and then the second vaccine. And so that messaging is out there. So it's going to require that messaging to those communities that it can understand it in a way that's acceptable for them.
Yep. Yeah. Jaylan, COVID and climate intersection. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. So many amazing things have been said already, so I'll keep it brief, but I think really what it's shown is what can happen when we let science lead action. And, you know, when we, just at the speed at which we came together, like, you know, action can happen quickly if we want it to. So as long as, you know, we can let the science, you know, push us forward and come together, I really think that that's what we can take from this in terms of climate action. So I echo all of the points that Angela and Mariah said, and thank you so much. I really appreciate learning from you guys. So,
yeah, and I was trying to find the link. I think right after this event, there's, I think Dr. Georges Benjamin, the executive director of APHA, is going to be on a panel on COVID and climate. So I was trying to find the link for folks if they want to hop from one event to another. But given that we are approaching the end of our time, I do want to do a couple of really quick, we had way more questions come in than we had time to answer. So thank you so much to our audience. I think, you know, you've given us a lot to think about too, but just wanting to end with a really couple quick lightning round questions. So keep really like 1 to 2 line answers here. Advice, we've gotten a couple questions about advice for budding health professionals. So what's that like thing you want them to keep top of mind as they think about careers in climate and health? Jaylan, why don't you kick us off?
I'm muted again, sorry. I really think that if you're interested in going into a career in climate, the first thing that you can do is start normalizing conversations about climate in your daily life, with your friends, with your family. Just get the conversation going. That is such a big and important part of it. You know, and making those small changes, you know, being an example of the action that you want to see. So, you know, keeping that in mind, just letting your passions drive you in that way. So that's my short answer.
Angela.
Join professional organizations. That's the thing that I tell folks, and especially if you're a student, join professional organizations and begin to build your networks and be true to who you are. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much credentialing you may have, if your reputation is bad, you will never succeed at moving anything that you want to move forward. So be true to yourself first, and to recognize when you need rest.
I think those were
that's so
such
important.
good
That
answers.
The rest thing. And I wish we're all members of APHA, I think, right? So that was a great answer. I'm hosting this, episode as the director of Climate for Health, but I'm an APHA member. I'm a member of the environment section. And I'm also a member of the American Geophysical Union. I sit on their geohealth section, and that's great advice. It's been a great opportunity. So yeah, for sure. Mariah, sorry. Yeah, I just thought the rest thing was so good.
Yeah, no, I too, I'm an APHA member, and I sit on APHA and CDC's joint tribal public health and tribal environmental health think tank. And so I would say for sure join groups that you're passionate about, join groups that you support, that are going to have people in them who can provide some of that support to you when you do need to take some time to heal for yourself too. But I think also, like, go after, like Jaylan said, do what you want to do. Like, I'm in law school and I'm all about policy and data, and so that's my path, is like policy change. And if you're passionate about your community, go work in your community. Go do it. Yeah.
I'm still working on that bridge. So that's so I think we're putting some great links in the chat. So make sure to check out, like, we have an upcoming ambassadors training, Climate for Health ambassadors training with APHA. So if you're looking to be that person to make that change, we'll give you some tools and resources through that training. So check that out. We have one last question today, which is National Public Health Week is coming up in the first week of April. So just around the corner. And it's actually the first week of April every year. And so what climate related activity do you have planned for Public Health Week? So what are you doing that first week of April to bring attention to climate and health, to celebrate Public Health Week? So Angela, why don't you go first?
Well, I'm leading the second cohort of Healthy Community Services Native Plant Academy, where we take youth 12 to 19 and explore our wetlands and the flora and fauna of Southeast Louisiana. So that's a 6-week-long cohort, and it begins the first week of April. So that's what I'll be doing for Public Health Week.
Awesome. And Mariah?
Currently I am hoping that the snow decides to stop so I can enjoy some just time outside. But I will be engaging in different virtual convenings for Public Health Week.
Great. And Jaylan?
Yeah, so the Emory Climate Analysis and Solutions team is going to be hosting a talk, hopefully with a professor from the Emory School of Medicine, to speak on environmental education and sustainability, but specifically to highlight air quality and climate impacts related to asthma, and also kind of tie in the environmental justice component and the susceptibility to COVID-19.
Fabulous. And so remember, it's that first full week of April. We'll be participating in the APHA and the Twitter chat, which I believe is the Wednesday of that week. And then Thursday is the Climate Justice Day. So I encourage everyone who tuning in to plan something for Thursday, April 8th, put it on the website, and let's use it as an opportunity to bring more attention to climate and health. I am having to wrap us up. I could have talked to you all day. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Angela, Mariah, and Jaylan, for joining us today for Let's Talk Climate. Thank you to APHA's Center for Climate Health and Equity for co-hosting with us and bringing us together for this conversation. We'll be posting this online. You'll be able to watch the recording. Maybe you're watching the recording now. Hi. And so, we're at the end of our time here today, but I know you have inspired our listeners to act on climate to improve our health and our family's health. For all our listeners, please click on the link to the survey when this webcast ends to provide your feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out the description below to let us know what you think. Engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. We hope to see you at the upcoming American Climate Leadership Summit at the end of April. Day 1, April 27th, includes the National Health and Climate Forum. You can register today at acls2021.org. Join us next week on Thursday, March 25th for the Let's Talk Climate episode, Act Now, 5 Ways You Can Make a Difference on Climate as a Matter of Faith, with our Blessed Tomorrow director and faith leaders. Our next Climate for Health episode will be released on April 15th, when I will hand over the hosting duties to Annabelle Castro-Thompson, and she'll host a whole episode in Spanish. So really looking forward to that. And then we also are celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the launch of our Let's Talk Climate webcast series in May with the episode Mothers Know Best, Practical Advice for Climate Action. So please make sure to register for that now. From all of us at ecoAmerica and Climate for Health, thank you. Please join me in caring for our climate in order to care for our health. Stay well, stay safe, and see you next week.